In a beautiful and grand building full of life, with a bright sky above its roof, an event was taking place where various high society individuals were invited to participate. The voice of someone announces that they had finally arrived, and the foot of a lady descends the stairs in red heels, thinking that today she would marry a man she had never seen before in her life. Around her, the people watching the lady descend the stairs are excited, finding her beautiful and recognizing her as the lady from the Western Empire. The girl descending the stairs had red eyes and silver hair with a tense expression, thinking she would finally see the face of her husband, until she hears a voice greeting her, the Duchess on, and she widens her eyes in surprise. A man with silver hair and blue eyes greets her, smiling as he introduces himself as the Archduke of Ternigin, by the name of Cassian. For him, it was a pleasure to see her again, but the Duchess freezes and points directly at the man in front of her in shock, wondering why she accepted to marry, and especially with a man like this. Clearly she was deceived. The beginning of that difficult relationship started precisely on that day, 3 months ago, in the ballroom of the Western Empire, at a party with a dance. People toasted and conversed wearing masks during the dance, while a lady stood outside just observing them. From the window, she looks at where the guard from the previous floor was, thinking that it was terrible, unable to believe that today had to be the party at the Imperial Palace. She was drinking with a group of knights the day before, and therefore didn't care about the party. At first, she wasn't planning to attend the ball, but that morning, a woman shouted at her that if she didn't go to the party, she would never leave her in peace again, forcing her to go. At the moment, she just had to present herself to the emperor after relieving a hangover, and at that moment people wondered if Miss Anne hadn't come again, because the Duchess was looking for her, furious. Even though she had said she would come, she still hadn't appeared. That struck the protagonist in the chest, hearing that she would get into trouble again. Imagining her mother chasing after her in that terrible manner only made her even more worried about how much her life would become a hell. For now, she should find the emperor without her mother, knowing so she could help her later. She continues walking outside the window, wondering where the emperor could be now, and decides to search on the 3rd floor. Jumping to the other building, she holds onto the balcony and skillfully leaps to the other side, landing where a man was standing, soon noticing the movement, also catching her by surprise because she didn't expect someone to be there. That person with silver hair and blue eyes wearing a mask was none other than Cassian. However, she didn't know him yet and wonders who that person was. After a long silence of both standing still, the protagonist remembers that now was not the time to investigate. When he extends his hand toward her, the girl jumps away, surprising him once more. Behind him, the guards approach, commenting that they heard a strange noise and asking if everything was okay, and he agrees that it was nothing, smiling slightly as he responds that it was just a lost street cat. Even having moved away from the unknown man, she decides to leave the true identity of that man aside, and takes advantage of the fact that there was no one in the hallway to enter through the window, jumping while feeling a bit of pain in her stomach. Thus, the protagonist enters the hall where several other nobles were, quickly noticing that there was an ownerless mask there, and she decides to take it for herself, ignoring another girl who was looking for her mask. Soon, she finally finds not only the emperor of the Western Empire being greeted by several other people around in the hall, but also that this man was also her boss, Sekelian IV, and her uncle. It was the ideal moment to follow and greet the emperor, but she stops walking when she realizes that a conversation was happening with a woman named Million. This was the Duchess of Brilch, Anne's mother, Rosalia Brilch, who was visibly furious while asking if people had seen her daughter around. Caught by surprise, because her mother was so close, she decides it was time to flee, ignoring the voice answering that the Duchess wouldn't see her daughter because she was wearing a mask. However, Rosalia herself didn't believe that because her daughter didn't even know the party was a masked one, irritating Anne as she was being followed even after fleeing. This was bad. She needed to escape somehow, and then she notices something that catches her attention. Running to the side, just as the Duchess interrupts her words, Anne hides from her mother, hoping that the two women will pass by without noticing her. The other woman asks what happened, and the Duchess responds that they could go the other way, worrying Anne because, at this pace, she would certainly end up being caught by her mother, so she closes her eyes, until she hears a voice that surprises her, saying that his kitten was there. Opening her eyes, she realizes it was the masked man she saw on the other floor, and he used his cloak to hide her from others. An asks if he was the person she had seen before, and Castian simply covers his lips with his index finger, signaling for her to be quiet. At this, Rosalia is shocked and apologizes because she didn't know there was a couple alone in that place, and Castian replies that it's all right. The Duchess asks if there was someone hiding in his cloak, and he laughs, saying that his partner was very shy, making An grimace. Rosalia then laughs and leaves with her companion, telling the young couple to have fun. When they leave, the protagonist sighs in relief and steps out from under the man's cloak, wondering why that man helped her. Trying to ignore the words from before that bothered her a little, Cassian asks if she found what she was looking for, smiling at her when he sees her confusion. And he explains that she looked like an intruder, eliciting a sigh from An, who didn't like explaining everything. Then, she asks why he didn't say anything if he knew she was an intruder, and he responds that it was simply because it was interesting. Blushing a little, the protagonist wonders who he was, because it was the first time she had seen him. Perhaps he was a foreigner. At this, Cassian comments that he might be interested in a street kitten, a nickname that makes An cross her arms, eliciting another charming smile from him, but she turns away, covering her mouth, hating the down hangover, feeling like she was going to vomit, and therefore needed to leave as quickly as possible. So, An thanks him for his help and says that when they meet again, she would return the favor. Taking an insignia out of her pocket and placing it in his hand, she says goodbye and leaves quickly. It was then that another man appeared, calling for Cassian, asking what was in his hand. Smiling, he replies that it was the reward from a street kitten, leaving the other man confused as to what exactly made him so happy. When Cassian asks why he is there, the man tells him that the emperor was calling for him, so he decides to go and see him. The Western Empire was becoming richer and more abundant than the Northern Empire, where he came from. And all this was thanks to one thing, the sword master who protected the empire. However, in history, there have only been a few hundred people who managed to achieve the title of sword master, and this master always saved the Western Empire from great destruction. Since he was there, he wanted to meet the sword master, or at least that's what Cassian thought he could do. While drinking his tea, he thought it would be fun to meet the master who was said to be so incredible. After telling this to Sekelian, he replies that the person known as the Sword Master had no shame and didn't even show up when called. Cassian understands that this was a very difficult person to deal with, and the Emperor confirms this because, although they couldn't help but boast, it was indeed a bit complicated. If the Emperor spread the rumor that An was a sword master abroad, the Duchess would kill him because it could prevent her from getting married. Then Cassian looks at the beautiful scenery around, and especially at the Duchess pulling An's ear, making him smile as he realizes that, in the end, they had caught her. Sekelian comments that they could start talking about the imperial marriage and asks if he found anyone of interest. Indeed, the purpose of the recent festivities was to create harmony between the Western and Northern empires, the place to seek Cassian's future marriage partner. Any girl would be fine, and the Emperor makes it clear so that the young man can choose from all the available options. If they meet the conditions, it doesn't matter who it is, but it would be good to marry someone who at least entertains him. This makes him remember his earlier interaction with An, especially when she said, "I will return the favor." Then he shows the emblem to the Emperor, responding that he wanted to marry that person, catching the man completely by surprise because that was An's insignia, and Cassian asserts that he would marry the owner of that insignia. The immense military power of the Western Empire and the battle of the heroes of their country belonged to the one they admired so much, the great knight of the Templar Order, An, recognized as the great sword master. Despite this, her mother always begged her to get married, and she ignored her. On the other hand, her family believed she was a problematic daughter who urgently needed to marry. Rosalia always insisted that she listen to her, also making sure that her problematic daughter didn't escape through the window, and they even had a candidate from a neighboring country. Excitedly, she mentioned that all the young women of her age were married. That love was a wonderful thing her daughter should try. It seemed so easy for her to say when it was Rosalia speaking, which made An's expression firm. Her mother asked if she knew what others called her, and the protagonist suggested it was Great Sword Master and National Heroine, but it was neither. After thinking for a while, An suggested it could be Mad Dolt, irritating Rosalia, because not only that, they called her the Mad Dog of the Empire. the Duchess began talking to other men about marriage, and they all shared their traumatic experiences with An, as they were beaten almost to unconsciousness. Everyone always refused marriage proposals because they were afraid of her, which made the protagonist smile, responding that they were all weaklings. In the end, not even the great swordmaster could escape her delicate mother's attack after mocking so many suitors. Sitting down, Rosalia sighed that this poor and sick mother just wanted to see her little daughter be loved. An asked if marrying or being married was an obligation, and she replied that everyone had the right to be happy in their own way and different forms. That made the Duchess smile and respond that she could live as she wished as long as it made her daughter happy. That's what she would allow. However, she couldn't ignore the fact that she didn't want to go out with anyone. Having a relationship made An grimace. Even the Emperor became concerned about this and chose to make her get married, which surprised An, who asked who the candidate was. Her mother revealed it was the Grand Duke of Terneuzen from the Northern Empire, catching her by surprise. Rosalia said many rumors claimed he was a very handsome man, and An asked how she could marry a foreigner from the Northern Empire like that. Her mother insisted that there was no other sensible man willing to marry her, at least not in their territory. The protagonist still refused, not wanting to marry someone she didn't even know, but she had no choice but to marry anyone else. So, Rosalia suggested that she at least meet him first to see if he was really good, especially since he was quite an attractive man, eliciting a sigh from the protagonist. When the Duchess insisted too much on the point of him being handsome, An got angry and shouted that she didn't want to marry anyone. After all, there was certainly no one who had gotten married or wanted to get married, at least in these times. 3 days later, even a week later, Rosalia continued trying to convince her daughter that he was a respectable man, a great match, and also quite talented. When 2 weeks passed and the Duchess asked if she could at least do one last favor for her, An shouted that it was fine. She would do it as long as she stopped talking. Thus, the long-awaited and irritating day arrived, and she dressed up, unable to believe she would actually marry a foreign man and probably even travel to another country. That made her sigh, thinking that even if they got married, she had lived comfortably until now. Her freedom probably wouldn't have any return after this, but her mother was so happy that it was almost irritating. If that was the case, there was only one thing left to do, which was to see the prince who awaited them and force him to refuse the marriage at all costs, even if An had to beat him up for it. In a meeting with the Emperor, they gathered in the hall. A maid guided the Duchess and her daughter to the place where they would have the meeting. An asked if her mother intended to stay there all day, and she replied that she did, because even the Duke was on his way. As expected, everyone sought benefits behind their backs, even though this could end in a catastrophic future. In the meantime, the Duchess kept chatting about random things with the maid, who had guided them to the location, giving the protagonist time to plan a solution to her problems. Noticing that there was a nearby window to escape if necessary, she discreetly opened the window, ready to use it whenever she felt threatened. When the Duchess looked at her daughter, noticing she had disappeared, she almost broke her fan in anger. After jumping out, the protagonist lands on the ground and wonders where she could escape to, until she notices a carriage parked near the building, seeming like a stroke of luck in her life. So, An starts running toward it, ready to beg if necessary to get out of that place. As soon as she opened the door to enter, who she found inside was none other than Cassian, surprising her. The young man comments that he has met a cute cat again, leaving her confused. Though he smiled, it didn't take long for the Shoutsteran to send chills down her spine as she realized she was being hunted. So, she promptly entered the carriage and closed the door, apologizing for it and asking for the journey to continue. He says she seemed like a young lady running away because she didn't want to get married, making her frown in irritation. Hearing that if she needed him, she could just use him, not something one usually says, making her wonder why he kept offering to help her as he did last time, and whether by any chance he knew her. She stares deeply at him, wondering if he was a poor artist needing her to owe him something in return. Noticing this, Cassian slowly responds that she didn't need to worry because he didn't want anything in return, making An assume he was just a man who liked to talk. So she begins to reply that if that was the case, then she would use him if he didn't mind, which was a pleasure for Cassian, who continued smiling at her the entire time. So, she asks him to be her lover for that day, and he agrees without hesitation again. The two leave for the city still in the carriage, and An asks where they were going while looking out the window, and he replies that it would be a date. The word makes her look at him in surprise, and he smiles, questioning if they shouldn't act like lovers as she requested. That being the case, he should be seen by many people when accompanied by his girlfriend. The idea of being seen by several people made her feel a little uncomfortable, but Castian explains that this way everyone would talk about it and could understand their commitment. The explanation makes An agree with him because that's how she could end her original engagement. So he smiles at her agreement, gladly accepting it. The two get out of the carriage to visit a bakery where Cassian presents her with a dessert that was quite famous, filled with red fruits. An stared at the dessert, confused, as she was the type of person who knew more about the battlefield than about desserts. Other girls excitedly commented upon seeing An, admiring her from a distance, curious to know who that man beside her was, if he could be her boyfriend because he was very handsome as well, and they even got excited to introduce themselves. Cassian listens to the people talking and looks at the protagonist, ignoring everyone else just to eat the dessert with a smile. Then he asks if she would like to know the quickest way to make everyone see them as lovers, and he extends his hand to wipe a bit of frosting from her cheek with his fingers, licking the frosting off with his tongue, saying it was indeed as delicious as the rumors said. Smiling, he says, that's how you make everyone believe they were lovers, and all the ladies watching them were shocked by the scene. An herself touches her cheek, nearly breaking the fall with that crazy man acting out of nowhere. After the whole date, the protagonist returns home and thanks him for the day, and Cassian was happy to have helped her. Still, An was surprised because it was more fun than she expected, smiling and hoping the rumors of her being with another man would spread. So, she gently smiles at the young man, thanking him for his help, saying she would repay him again in the future, eager for her engagement to end. Meanwhile, the young man smiles and thanks her for saying she would repay him, making her fall silent. He asks if she hated the idea of marrying someone she hadn't even met that much. Obviously, An agrees because it was all because her impatient parents wanted her to marry. She recalls when she sought advice from her married sister, who said it was suspicious for her to marry the Archduke of the North because he should have married at least once by now. With that position, there must certainly be something wrong with him. If not flaws, it must certainly be a mistress. That's why her older sister didn't think the other person who agreed to marry was okay. It was certainly irritating to marry a foreigner. That's what An also concluded and spoke openly, leaving Castian silent and almost shocked because it was the first time he was treated as irritating so openly. Still, he simply responds that he hoped her wishes would come true. Soon, rumors that An had a very handsome lover began to spread rapidly among the high-caste people, and the protagonist knew that her marriage could be cancelled that way, but to her surprise, her mother's reaction was entirely different, smiling because at least she could have told her that she was with a secret lover, and she agreed that An should marry the secret lover if she truly loved him. An began to sweat nervously when the Duchess said that the Archduke didn't care about scandals. He was really a lovely young man. That was why the Duchess didn't want a powerful political marriage. She just wanted her to marry anyone. In the end, her attempt to break off the marriage was completely wasted. The only option left for the protagonist was to confront her mother directly now. So, An says that she really didn't want to marry anyone. This leaves her mother shocked before she slowly sits down in a chair, silently. She asks An to marry him and live by his side for 3 months. If she doesn't like her husband, she can divorce him. Instead, the condition was to live a peaceful life. If she doesn't enjoy their time together, she would never ask her daughter to marry again. That made An think that she could easily endure that period, and she quickly agrees. Still hearing her mother explain that she couldn't hit or kill anyone, much less send him flying, the protagonist agrees that she would try. If necessary, she would certainly kill him for the sake of her freedom. Thus, An's marriage was established, and the news of her matrimony spread throughout the Western Empire. People talked about it, and the knights believed that if An went abroad, the military loss would be enormous. With that irritation, the emperor responds that he would honor An with the highest decoration possible in the Western Empire with the title of princess. Thus, he announces that An was the future of the Western Empire, catching everyone by surprise with the sudden decision. It seemed a bit too much in the protagonist's opinion, to the point of feeling pressured. On the other hand, in the Northern Empire, rumors that the Archduke of Turnungen was getting married was spreading among the ladies as well. Although they were joyfully discussing who he would marry, one of the girls, one with pink hair, was not very happy with the news. Cassian was the son of an emperor, second in line to the throne, the number one man all women wanted to marry, even above the crown prince. The position of Archduchess, which all young noblewomen dreamed of, had just disappeared. Although there was a tremendous uproar in the Northern Empire, Cassian, who was the target of these rumors, remained perfectly calm. In his home, he asks his attendant if there was any other information, and the man replies that there was. While listening to his work reports, Cassian recalls that Sekelian's reaction bothered him, but it seemed like just his imagination. Until his attendant mentions that something had troubled him, and as expected by the Archduke, something was still missing. He says that apparently there was a troublemaker in the Duchy of Brilch, and apparently his nickname was the Mad Dog of the Empire. The reason why it's difficult to obtain information from the Duchy of Brilch seemed to be due to the existence of this mad dog. Cassian asks what he did, and the man reports that he heard that if you make a mistake, you be beaten to death, which makes him sigh, unable to believe that Anne and such a violent man could be in the same family, and he wonders if that's why she was so calm. Still, it brought a smile to his face because it was somewhat amusing. At that moment, the attendant mentioned that the airship was arriving, so the Archduke stands up, thinking that when Anne sees him again, he is confident she will have an interesting expression. Meanwhile, the protagonist, with a bored expression while listening to one of the maids, say that the airship was about to land as well. Then, she also reminds Anne that she couldn't kill, hit the people she didn't like, and especially couldn't use the sword. She should smile and speak sweetly, and act with elegance, yet Anne can only look at the maid, not understanding if that's what she really thought of her. So she descends the stairs to present herself at the location, and the maid guides her to follow as they had rehearsed in the beginning. However, when Anne passes through the doors and meets the Archduke, she points in his direction, completely shocked, looking at the young man who introduced himself to her as the Archduke of Turnungen. Anne was shocked because this was his true identity, and that's why they had met in the carriage the other time. In the end, she couldn't help but be shocked because they had deceived her so well. Suddenly, she turns to go back where she came from, leaving Cassian and the others confused. Saying that she wanted to go back, she ordered the maid Eva to come up again, and both the maid and Cassian called out to the irritated protagonist. He quickly approached and reminded her that she had an obligation to repay him a favor, irritating Anne even more. Before she could say something offensive, the maid shouted for her to be careful, then said that Anne was very delicate. Because of this, Eva asked the prince to treat the girl as if she were made of glass, leaving Anne completely puzzled, wondering what she was talking about. At another moment, the maids were shouting in the garden, desperately searching for the protagonist because they had asked her not to go out alone. Instead of responding to them, Anne remained up in the tree, hidden, wondering how she ended up in that situation. Despite the maids insisting on worrying about her porcelain skin, neither she nor the Archduke, who was watching everything while looking at the protagonist from the window, did anything, and Cassian just laughed, wondering how the protagonist managed to get up there. It made him feel like he had adopted a kitten instead of a real wife. Suddenly, Anne felt a shiver and looked toward the house's window, wondering if someone had seen her because she could sense a presence. Even though there was no one at the window, she'd have felt that someone had been watching her from there just a moment before. First, she decided to climb down to the ground when no one was nearby. Still hearing the maids calling for her, she hid behind the tree to avoid being seen. After a moment, they decided to turn around and search on the other side of the residence. When they left, Anne sighed in relief, only for the Archduke to appear behind her, catching her by surprise, making Anne turn and ask since when he had been standing there, to which she replied, "Just now," making her wonder why he was so silent. Anne worried that he must have seen her jumping from the tree, but he asked if she liked it a lot, once again surprising her when he affirmed that she must really like his face because she was always staring at him that way. This made her look away and stammer a response, more tense than embarrassed. The Archduke felt it was fun to tease her, smiling as he asked how she felt about meeting her unlikely marriage partner. Slowly, Anne replied that it wasn't as bad as she thought, making him curious, again leaving her frustrated, unable to believe she had been mistaken, but still worried about the possibility of a lover. With that long silence, Cassian asked if she was thinking about something else again, even right in front of him. This time making her nervous, she questioned where he had learned such words, because they weren't even married yet. He replied that they soon would be, and he held her hand to bring it to his lips, saying it was too late for her to escape. Turnagain Castle was more turbulent than ever before, but there was a reason for that. It was the wedding day of the owner of Turnagain Castle, and the maid Eva was even crying with emotion. And Ann complained a little because the maid was talking as if her mother had passed away, but she was very much alive to see it happening in person. While being prepared by the maids, Ann listened to her mother talking through the crystal ball, wanting to see her wedding in person, to which the protagonist replied that she would be watching through the magic sphere anyway. The Duchess smiled as she said that Sir Kellyan would also be watching the wedding regardless, mentioning that he had also gone to the Northern Empire to watch in person, worrying Ann because she intended to divorce afterward, but the pressure from all sides was too much. A little later, the maids announced that they had finally finished preparing her. Now perfectly ready, they praised the protagonist, saying she looked beautiful, even more so than any other bride they had seen. Ann couldn't believe she really had to do something she didn't want to, and she wondered if she should enter a loveless marriage. That's when her mother complimented her for being so beautiful, especially when dressed appropriately, wishing her well because she was gaining a new family, which surprised the protagonist to see her mother smiling like that. At the same time, Ann realized it was all to make her mother happy in the first place. In the wedding hall, many people had gathered to watch the event. Around them, several ladies wondered who the bride chosen by the Archduke was and if he might have fallen in love at first sight. The attendant was also worried because he didn't know what his lord was thinking to get married so suddenly. Meanwhile, in the hall, people continued talking about the bride and how she must be very beautiful until the doors opened and it was announced that the groom and bride were making their entrance. Han and Cassian walked through the doors hand in hand, dressed in white and walking together among the guests, surprising the ladies even more as they looked at the protagonist, who was incredibly beautiful. Tense, Ann questioned whether this was truly the right decision, no matter how much time she spent thinking about it. As they reached the altar, the priest began to announce that he would like to thank the guests on behalf of the couple. He asked if the bride swore to love her groom forever, which made her even more tense, wondering if it was really okay to make such a false vow, but despite everything, she averted her gaze and agreed to swear. Then, the priest asked if the groom swore to love his bride forever, and Cassian agreed without hesitation. At that moment, he announced that they could kiss as a promise that their love would last forever, catching Ann off guard. Blushing, she looked a bit tense when Cassian lifted the veil from her face and held her chin, saying that if she didn't want to, she should run away now because it would be her last chance. But Ann made a face, responding that he was the one who said it was too late for that. This made him smile as he agreed, looking deeply into her eyes and pulling her closer by the waist. Before kissing Ann, and all the guests applauded the two at the altar. As they pulled away, the protagonist felt dizzy and breathless after the kiss. The priest smiled as he declared that the Archduke of Turnagain Cassian and Ann were officially married. Hearing this and seeing Cassian's usual smile, Ann blushed, feeling like she was in big trouble. Turnagain Castle was abuzz with the wedding banquet. The maids hurriedly pulled the protagonist along so she could rest a little because they didn't want to strain her feet. Ann grimaced because she could do all of this on her own, but the maids insisted on helping her. Remembering the kiss during the wedding, her face blushed again, and she tried to forget it because she was overthinking. Finally, the maids showed her to the Archduchess's quarters, where she would live from now on. It was an enormous room that impressed Ann, looking much better than she had expected. Sitting on the bed, she hoped she could rest peacefully now, sighing before hearing the maids say they would leave, laughing, and hoping that the two could have a good night together. Ann didn't understand their expressions at all and realized that she couldn't stay still. The last thing she wanted was to become a woman who killed her husband on the first day of their marriage. So, she decided to flee and opened the window of the room immediately, seeing the night sky, and realizing that it was possible to run in that direction until she heard a voice asking her what she was doing up there. Looking back, Ann realized it was Cassian who had entered the room. This time, he was staring at her seriously as Ann realized she had been caught at the perfect moment of her escape. Backing up closer to the window, she wondered what she should do and whether she could pretend to faint or maybe just be honest for once. When Cassian insisted on knowing what she was doing, the protagonist smiled and stammered that she just wanted to get some fresh air, but he was skeptical of her answer because she was doing it at this time of night and right on the windowsill, Remaining silent, he asked as she was trying to take her own life, leaving her completely surprised and not understanding what he meant by that. She denied it, saying it wasn't anything like that, and she didn't even know if it was possible to lose her life from falling from that height. Lowering his gaze, he responded that he understood, but An didn't bother to correct his thoughts because she couldn't tell him she was trying to avoid the wedding night. As he approached, Cassian extended his hand to the protagonist, who took it and stepped down from the window. As she stood on the floor, Cassian asked her to be careful with her own body, making her nervous because she really would have to spend the first night with him. Would she really become the wife who took her husband's life on the first night? Meanwhile, the Archduke was only thinking about Eva's words that An was too delicate and should be treated like glass. Even though he knew she was delicate, he didn't realize she was mentally pressured to the point of trying to take her own life. So, he continued holding her hand and guided her further into the room, while An didn't know what to do. Maybe she would have to knock Cassian out now, but she stopped when he turned and called her name, suddenly lifting her in his arms with a smile that made her blush, unable to believe she would really spend the wedding night with a man she didn't even know. As she closed her eyes, she tried to think of a solution, but suddenly she just found herself being placed on the bed and having her body covered, leaving her even more confused than before by his actions. Cassian knew she must be having a hard time, so he just wanted her to sleep well, surprising the protagonist because they were really just going to sleep, even on their first night. Noticing her shock, he leaned in and asked her not to worry too much and just rest. Then, he turned to leave the room, leaving An in bed, still quiet, and closed the door behind him. Although the Archduke left as she wanted, she ended up being treated like a child, which was almost offensive to An. Marriage was a means for the aristocracy, where the culture of marriage existed for one purpose: family prosperity. That's why many people thought that the marriage to Archduke Tannhausen would be that type of union, until they saw the two of them at the altar during their wedding and noticed the way the Archduke looked at the new Archduchess, leaving the ladies impressed by how much they seemed to love each other. Moreover, the Archduchess had left her wedding banquet, being quickly carried by the other maids to her room afterward. Due to the maids' overprotection, concerned about her vulnerable state, it was an unusual situation. A man asked if it made sense for the Archduchess to be absent from her own banquet, and another replied that it was because she was being well taken care of. There were rumors that the Archduke personally drove away any men who approached the Archduchess, and they supposed he had fallen madly in love at first sight. The misunderstandings continued to intensify day after day after that, but the truth was different. While An was sitting under the tree under Cassian's gaze from a window, his attendant looked at his lord a bit incredulously, wondering what he was doing and if that was the look of true love. Suddenly, the attendant, Alan, was called by the Archduke, who looked in his direction, asking him to inquire what he wanted. After a moment of silence, Cassian asked what it meant when the bride tried to take her own life on the first night, catching the other completely off guard, who responded that he didn't know, but it probably meant that the bride hated the marriage to death, making the Archduke sigh. Then, Alan handed him a letter that was an invitation from the second Imperial Prince, surprising Cassian as Mackenzie left immediately after delivering it. Alan asked when the Archduke intended to present his greetings to the Emperor, and slowly, he replied that it would be soon. A little later, the protagonist was having tea in the garden with her maid when her mother chatted about her recent marriage, leaving the girl a bit tense in her chair. When she choked on her tea, Eva became concerned for An, who coughed and said she was fine, feeling the urge to destroy the magic sphere her mother used to talk, until Rosalia mentioned that her men were causing a scandal, but as the Golden Dragon Knights went on strike, demanding An's return, the Emperor asked her to tell them to stop those men, surprising the protagonist, as she heard that they had already lost contact with some of them. Sekelian felt abandoned, and since An hadn't responded to their calls, they became worried, but she said that if they couldn't find her, they could ask Uncle Sano for help. Her mother commented that she had heard that she hadn't greeted Duke Sano either, making the protagonist avert her gaze and respond that it was because she was a bit busy. But obviously she didn't want to talk to an irritating person, but it seemed that after everything, they went on that huge strike, worrying and irritating Arm with the likely jokes they must be making about her now, until a maid called out to the Archduchess, pulling her out of her thoughts. When she heard that the Archduke had sent her some gifts, or rather, a pile of them, Rosalia became emotional, saying her husband must really like her, and An wondered if these actions were just because he was worried about what happened the night before. Suddenly, the protagonist felt like she had just seen something in the bush behind the servants with the gifts. It was the presence of a man with a smile on his face, making her wonder why he was there. This man was Crave, who was supposed to be in the Western Empire, but suddenly appeared there. She hadn't even invited him to the wedding to avoid anyone discovering he was a knight, so his presence was problematic, to the point where she considered that she was seeing things. But even after looking twice, there was no doubt that the man was indeed Crave. Now that she had seen him, her first priority would be to find an opportunity to get that guy out of there before anyone noticed. Pretending to pour tea into her cup, she whispered to him, asking why he was there and telling him to leave. To her frustration, Crave laughed and replied that he didn't want to, almost making her break her cup in anger. If that was the case, she would find a way to forcefully expel them herself. But before she could do anything, An felt a shiver from a strange presence, making her wonder who it was. As she tried to move, she grew frustrated, because the dress she was wearing was getting in the way. Looking back, the one who had approached and held her by the waist was none other than Cassian, who asked if she was okay. Caught by surprise, An realized that it really wasn't her imagination. Just like the previous time, she hadn't sensed his presence, which probably made him different from others, likely powerful. He must have known she was a sword master, even if she hadn't said it. One liar knows another, although Cassian felt she always resembled a cat. Straightening her posture, he asked what she was doing, and the servants took the opportunity to leave the area. While being scrutinized, the protagonist stammered that it was nothing, positioning herself with her back to the bush. Changing the subject, she asked what he wanted there, because she couldn't let him see Crave. At that, he asked if she liked the gifts, which confused her for a moment until she finally remembered the boxes left there beside them. The way she referred to them as things and not gifts surprised him a bit, but An stammered that she liked them, even though she hadn't seen them yet. She hoped he hadn't noticed, though the Archu was quite aware that she didn't seem sincere. Suddenly, he noticed movement in the bush and became alert, but before he could do anything, Rosalia started speaking to her son-in-law with great enthusiasm because she could see his face even from there. Again, leaving the protagonist curious as she remembered that her mother was still there too. So, Cassian bowed and introduced himself to An's mother, making her extremely happy that her daughter had such a handsome husband. Even Cassian complimented his mother-in-law, saying that her daughter had inherited her beauty, embarrassing An even more than before. When her mother insisted on continuing to talk, the protagonist couldn't take it anymore and decided to turn off the magic sphere, wanting to get rid of it. After doing so, An apologized to the Archduke, who responded that her mother was quite adorable, drawing a disbelieving look from her. Finally, An decided to change the subject and asked what brought him there since he should have been working at that time. Instead, he inquired if she was feeling better, leaving her confused until she remembered it was about the earlier incident in the room. Cassian averted his gaze, wondering if marrying him was really so horrible, worrying the protagonist, who needed to clear up the misunderstanding. He said he would help her, so he just asked her to explain what she did the previous night, making An try to stammer a response that she was fine. Although she didn't know what to say, whether it was the truth, it would be quite embarrassing to say it. So, she decided to respond that there was no need to worry because she was indeed fine. Still looking downcast, he said that if she ever wanted to talk, she could do so when she felt comfortable. This was driving the protagonist crazy. It seemed like he really wanted to know the truth. As Cassian turned to leave, still embarrassed, An approached to ask him to wait a moment, trying to grab his wrist. Making him stop, the protagonist tried to stammer about the first night, and with great effort, she confessed that she was afraid of the first night, her face completely red, and that's why she wanted to run away. This time, An wasn't lying because she was afraid of taking Cassian's life on the first night. Knowing that she'd tried to escape the first night out of fear made Cassian start to laugh because it seemed almost silly from his point of view, especially since he could hardly believe that An could be so cute. So he placed his hand on her shoulder, saying that if that was the case and what she wanted, he wouldn't lift a finger, which surprised her. He smiled, agreeing that it could be a secret just between the two of them. This made her remember that he had done the same before, and Cassian's offer was quite suspicious. He was a powerful man who made An want to know more about him to understand him. Even so, she agreed with his suggestion, smiling back because she could go along with it for now. Back in his office, remembering the protagonist's confession, Cassian smiled because he hadn't thought she was afraid of that. Seeing his lord's smile made Alan wonder what had happened and if he had finally gone mad after getting married. Despite calling out to him, the Archduke seemed perfectly normal, so he let it go. That's when Cassian told his assistant that there was a rat hiding in the castle and they should find it and kill it. Meanwhile, back in the garden, the maids cried out in surprise because the crystal ball had been broken, wondering who had done it, because it should have had a reinforcement spell and couldn't be destroyed by human power. While they were yelling, wondering who could have broken it and who should have been responsible for taking care of the magic sphere, Anne sipped her tea quietly. It was a relief to have broken it because it was an annoying sphere, and she took the opportunity to destroy it when no one else was watching. Crying, a red-haired maid shouted apologies because she was the one responsible for it. Bowing because she should have been more careful, she felt very sorry for having made such a big mistake at work. The housekeeper shouted that she could never buy another sphere, even if she worked in that castle for 100 years, and breaking something so precious was terrible. Then, Anne tried to get the maid Eva's attention by asking what would be done with her, and the maid replied that she would be expelled as part of the rules when something wrong was done. Furthermore, she would have to pay the debt, and since she committed such a serious crime, she wouldn't be hired by other families. In short, her professional life was over. Hearing all this made the protagonist choke from coughing so much, realizing what was happening next to her. She stood up, asking what was going on, feeling that she couldn't let this continue because it was her fault and she should solve the situation. The older maid said it was nothing she should worry about, but Anne responded that if it was happening in her castle, it was indeed her business. That made Eva almost cry with emotion from the heartfelt words, ready to inform the Duchess of what had happened that day. The protagonist said she was aware that the magic sphere had been broken, and even though she wanted to ignore it, it was too noisy, and she would find out anyway. She didn't know why they were making such a fuss over something like this. It wasn't a big deal, and they could end it soon, hoping that way the maid wouldn't be expelled. Faced with such kind actions, the maids were impressed because Anne was indeed very merciful, to the point that her gaze was killing them. The housekeeper questioned if it was really okay to leave it like this, and Anne responded that people could make mistakes in life. They could buy another magic sphere. Therefore, she ordered them to end this problem once and for all the others to return to work. A little later, the red-haired maid approached the protagonist and, still crying, asked her to accept her deep loyalty, catching her by surprise. Although Anne said it wasn't a big deal, the maid shouted that she was her savior and knelt, affirming that she would owe her for life. Even though she herself was the one who broke the magic sphere in the first place, the protagonist nervously smiled, asking her to calm down. Another maid approached the red-haired maid, Erica, and cheerfully showed something to both of them inside a small handbox. Because she imagined something like this could happen, she sent enough magic tools and quickly acquired a second magic sphere, which certainly didn't make Anne happy at all, who wondered what she should do now. Later, the housekeeper reported the events to Ellen, which brought a smile to Cassian, who didn't expect Anne to have an interest in this kind of thing. Then he began to leave the office because he wanted to see his wife now, and ignoring both the maid and his assistant, he left them right there. Alan felt that the Archduke was really going crazy because before, he did nothing but work. Meanwhile, Erica was shouting and looking for Anne, all because she wanted her to accept her loyalty, which made the protagonist wonder why she was always in that situation, or maybe it was just her. When she heard a voice calling her, she was startled until she realized that it was Cray who had approached, walking through the bushes. But that wasn't the only thing that surprised her, as for some reason, he was wearing women's clothes that made him look very strange. He smiled, because it was supposed to be a disguise, but at that point, it seemed anything but that. He was supposed to look like a maid, but Anne felt like she should really kill this guy for his incompetence. She asked if no one noticed, and Crave assured her that his disguise and infiltration skills were perfect. Anne asked about the knights and what he was doing there, and he cheerfully said that he had quit, which caught the protagonist by surprise, especially because he replied that it was all to be by his leader's side. Cray stated that he had no choice but to swear loyalty to the Emperor and fulfill his duty, but he just wanted to be loyal to Anne, although she turned to walk away and ignored him. The knight continued asking if she had forgotten the battle that saved her life because his loyalty was heavier than death, questioning what kind of marriage this was in the first place, and he thought Anne was pretending to be vulnerable, but he wanted his magnificent captain back. Even though she heard all of this, she felt that he was too noisy and almost wanted to ask him to shut up. Irritated, Crave approached her, asking her to bring back the Swordmaster because clearly there was something wrong with An. The protagonist ordered him to be quiet and leave because her uncle would soon be home, so they could do it together. Still, Crave begged to the point of crying to let him be her servant, which only seemed foolish from her perspective. It was then that they suddenly noticed Cassian had approached them, not looking very pleased with any of it. He asked his wife how she could be alone in a place like that, so far from all her other maids, and even the mansion's guards. This made An worried, stuttering and not knowing how to respond or how quickly he had arrived. Nervously, she smiled, trying to introduce Crave, though she wasn't exactly sure what she should say. Cassian said he had never seen her before, leaving An completely shocked by what she had just heard. Then he commented that he didn't think this new lady should be a maid in the Arcturgy, and An explained that it was because she'd brought her from the Western Empire. Even giving a smile of understanding, the protagonist could hardly believe he would leave things like that. Crave bowed and elegantly said he would withdraw now, which didn't make An very comfortable with the whole interaction. As Crave walked away, he sighed because his disguise was indeed perfect, and he was confident of that. But when he recalled the two expressions of Cassian, he wondered if by chance he had seen wrong. Watching Crave leave, the protagonist realized that her husband's expression was not very good. When he looked in her direction, she asked if by chance he was angry after all. That's what it seemed like considering his tense face. But Cassian asked if she was talking to the maid alone in secret, to which the protagonist gestured no. With a smile, he agreed that he would believe her, relieving An because she wouldn't have to focus too much on explaining herself. Still, she mentioned that the maid from earlier didn't seem very normal, having big muscles to the point of looking like a man. And Cassian responded that it was very impolite to doubt someone's gender based on appearance, which even surprised An, although she agreed. That made An even doubt whether Crave's disguise really worked on him, even though it was horrible. After a moment of silence, Cassian said that, as he thought, her thoughtful gaze was beautiful. Widening her eyes, An asked if it was true, because they always said her eyes looked like a killer's. Obviously, he agreed because he was always serious, and would never lie about that, especially about how beautiful he found her. Before, they called her a sinister red-eyed assassin, the executioner of Luelgosa, always treated like a monster cursed with blood-red eyes. An said that since she was young, everyone was afraid to make eye contact with her and always avoided her. It was like a family curse. Although there is only one such person per generation, her uncle and grandfather were red-eyed swordmasters, which caught Cassian's attention. She said that the one who captured the Apocalypse dragon that awoke 30 years ago, the man who ended the war with the Eastern Union 10 years ago. Her uncle was a dragon slayer, but despite the protagonist being responsible for ending a war with the Eastern Union, she wondered who spread the rumor like that. Still, An said that her uncle was a good man, which made Cassian smile and left her curious to know why. However, when the protagonist called him Your Highness, he was annoyed and asked her to call him dear, which completely surprised her because it was so sudden, and it also embarrassed her because she had never said anything like that before. That said, the Arctu decided that he would call her by her first name, An, from now on, and that's why he also wanted her to call him by his first name. Hesitating, she tried to say Cassian's name, which brought a happy smile from him, praising that it was much better that way. Later, in his office, Cassian felt that from An's reaction, she didn't seem like a dangerous person and could investigate the intruder later. At another time, Crave happily went to meet the protagonist, but it had been 2 days since he had been dressed like that, and to his surprise, no one had noticed yet. That made An curious to know if only she found it strange, so she called for Crave, who immediately responded to her. When she asked him to explain what had happened, he said that after she left to get married, the Golden Dragon Knights turned upside down because they all had the same reason to stay together. They were all there just to follow An, and soon she ended up leaving, so they couldn't remain together if the reason they were there was gone. Laughing, he mentioned that he was the first to resign, which almost disappointed the protagonist because she hoped he would be a bit more normal. An felt that she should have told him it was only a 3-month marriage until Crave mentioned that he met Ergen when he was going to submit his resignation. Probably because Ergen had also resigned, which wasn't something the protagonist wanted to happen so casually. That was when he noticed a maid was watching them from the door, and it was none other than Erica. This surprised An, who didn't know how long she had been standing there, observing and listening to her conversation with the knight. At that moment, Crave said that the maid seemed to be bothering them, and he could take care of it by himself. This worried An about what exactly he intended to do suddenly as he approached Erica, who was still discreetly spying. But before he could do anything, the knight quickly opened the door and startled the maid because he blocked her line of sight. He said that the Arctichess had already received her loyalty, so Erica should pledge her loyalty in the next life. Frustrated, Erica ran away, crying and shouting that she was really mean after having cast her aside like that. With that, Crave closed the door and smiled at An because he thought he had done a great job, even though she was clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. But as expected, the protagonist felt that she should send that man away with her Uncle Sano once and for all because he would only cause problems in the future. On another day, Crave was still by her side, this time serving tea in the garden while taking a small break for a snack. An commented that she would like to be alone, so she will pretend to leave, but he replied that she would soon be going to the capital and would need a servant like him. There was a process that every married aristocrat had to go through, and that was the emperor's approval. The union of both families was presided over in the name of the emperor, a means of consolidating the aristocratic hereditary right. In those days, An knew it was all just a formality. That was when other maids approached, seeming irritated, but wanting to talk to the protagonist about something. In fact, both the maid Martha and Erica and the others seemed intensely fervent this time. They had probably discovered that Crave was a man, especially considering how Martha was staring at him. It wouldn't be strange if they had noticed. Crave and Martha stared at each other deeply until An asked them to explain what had happened. Then they shouted that the Arctichess was very cruel, catching her completely by surprise and not knowing the reason for the accusation. Erica said that they were the first to be with her when she became the Arctichess, but now she had gotten too close to the other maid, and that's why they were upset. It seemed like they were favoring that new lady because she was from the Western Empire, so they wanted to travel to the West and wanted a chance too. Martha said that was what they wanted to talk to An about because it was wrong to favor just one of the maids so much. With that, the protagonist managed to understand that the maids were actually jealous of her knight. Sighing, she smiled, because they had misunderstood everything, and it wasn't favoritism at all, but rather that she liked all of them together, which made all the maids emotional. They asked if it was really true because they all liked An as well, which should be enough to stop the situation. Days later, on the day they would leave for the capital, everyone gathered in front of the mansion so the protagonist could say goodbye to everyone. And Cashin asked his wife not to be nervous because he just intended to say hello. Then he took her hand and brought it close to his lips, saying goodbye because they wouldn't see each other for some time. They would only see each other in a few days after he finished his pending matters. An replied that he should go first because of her uncle, and the Archduke simply mentioned that they would be together soon. Finally, touching her face, he leaned in to kiss her, saying that even if she missed him, she should be patient. The romantic scene made all the maids emotional about how adorable it was because it seemed like the couple was really close. Meanwhile, Crave, with his horse and other knights, left to meet Duke Sano, who smiled when he saw them because he had been waiting for Crave, now that he had finally arrived with the carriage where An was. Inside, Eva praised Crave for being very diligent, and An responded that it was why he was second in command. Now that she thought about it, the protagonist realized it was the first time she traveled by carriage, as she was always riding her own horse. Still, for her, it wasn't bad at all to be able to observe the view from inside the carriage and not think about anything too serious. Remembering Kaskin's kiss, she couldn't help but feel a little disappointed, which made her blush in surprise. Not knowing how she could be thinking these things, she thought she was becoming strange because she was focusing too much on the Archduke. In fact, An wasn't used to being calm. It was a big waste of time for her to have nothing to do during her day-to-day life. Suddenly, the carriage creaked and shook to the point where Erica let out a scream of surprise. Outside, the knights shouted that they were being ambushed with several arrows coming their way. Crave yelled that everyone should gather to defend the carriage and protect the Arctichess as quickly as possible. The knights stood ready to protect the carriage and also Duke Sano, who ducked down, covering his ears. Crave shouted for everyone to stay on alert and in defensive formation, but they hadn't expected something like this to happen just as they arrived in the Northern Empire. Meanwhile, in his office, Cashin was playing with a chessboard and started to focus specifically on a knight piece. This caught Alan's attention, who asked what was wrong, and the Archduke said that the pieces seemed off that day. As he looked at the knight piece, he thought of a knight and wondered what that was supposed to mean. Suddenly, a servant came running to report something urgent that had just happened. It was about the surprise attack on the Archduchess, which shocked the Archduke instantly. Meanwhile, Arn noticed that a smoke bomb had been set off outside the carriage. It was too dangerous if things continued at that pace, even with the maids determined to protect the protagonist. Arn apologized to Erika as she struck her on the back, knocking her out inside the carriage. Before she could leave, a knight worried that it was too dangerous to go outside, but just like she did with the maid, she knocked the knight out with a single move. Stepping out of the carriage, Arn began to draw her sword for combat, preparing to use her skills as the sword master to defend everyone. Meanwhile, Caskin and his companion were preparing to travel on horseback, but the Archduke seemed especially agitated. Worried about Arn and hoping she was safe, he couldn't understand why he was so nervous, and if it was because he was going to lose his valuable knights. At the same time, Crave was impressed by what he saw before his eyes. The legendary swords descended from the Luelgosa family were two soul-devouring swords. The infamous sword Nevermore was now wielded by Arn, who fought her enemies without difficulty. Quickly, the atmosphere changed with that sword in hand, and even Crave couldn't help but think that his leader was really cool. During the battle, the protagonist was caught off guard when her attack was blocked, and the man himself was shocked, not knowing who this strong woman was. But before he had the chance to flee, Arn quickly killed him with her sword, leaving a large number of bodies scattered on the ground. Nevermore laughed because Arn had called it now. It had been a while since it was summoned, but it ended up being overburdened. It was too noisy, so the protagonist simply tossed the sword back where she had drawn it from, ignoring its complaints. A little later, Crave approached Arn, who still had bloodstains on her clothes and face. He mentioned that she should have left at least one alive so they could find out who sent them, something she completely forgot to do. Even so, she responded that they would come back on their own if they had something to do. She was then caught by surprise when the knights ran to see if Arn was okay and if she had almost been kidnapped for being out there. Not only that, but Cassian had just arrived at the scene and quickly dismounted from his horse. The protagonist noticed that the expression on his face was quite grim as he approached, until he simply pulled her close into an embrace. As he pulled away, the Archduke smiled, saying he was glad he came after all, and checked if she wasn't hurt in any way. Averting her gaze, Arn stammered that she was fine, but even so, he touched her face, wiping the blood stain from her cheek. Finally, Cashin looked around and asked who had done this, worrying Arn because she didn't want him to know the truth. That was when her uncle Sano approached to explain the situation, saying that Crave saved Arn, who had almost been kidnapped and killed her enemies. The Duke's words left the knight paralyzed with surprise, not understanding anything that was happening. Even so, Arn pointed to him and agreed that this was indeed the case, surprising him even more. The Archduke looks at him and asks if he really did all that, and slowly, looking at the bodies around, he gestures that it was indeed true. Crossing her arms, there was an aura in Arn that indicated she would deal with him if he didn't go along with the story they were creating. Finally, Crave slowly agrees that he did indeed do all that and that he was very good at what he did, though he seemed to have serious difficulties lying about what had happened. In the capital of the Northern Empire, people were still gossiping about the Archduke and Archduchess who had fallen in love at first sight and quickly married. No one would have imagined that he would marry the princess from the Western Empire, which made them wonder what would happen to Haley. Because she was like a dog chasing a chicken, yet there were still many other people who wouldn't react well to that marriage. Later, when Arn and Caskin arrived, the protagonist noticed that the mansion of the Archduke of Terneuzen was truly enormous. On the way, they were greeted by a butler who welcomed them, and the Archduke was happy to see that man after so much time. He introduced himself as the mansion's butler and asked if it was all right for them to take a tour of the mansion to get acquainted. Thus, in the imperial palace in the Northern Empire, Sano sighed, looking quite tired as he rested on a sofa after the disturbance in the carriage. Because a few hours earlier, when Sano approached to say that those probably weren't all the assailants, he noticed that Cashin seemed strange. Turning around, he said he already knew who was responsible for the surprise attack, darkly touching the Duke's shoulder and assured him there was nothing to worry about, because An was very precious to him and wouldn't cause any problems for them, despite being determined and visibly ready to defend her at all costs. Now, Sano wondered if it was a good idea to send An with that Archduke, worrying that she might become the victim of some conspiracy. But knowing his niece, An would certainly return after taking everyone's life. For now, he just had to wait and see how long that would take. That's when a servant approached because His Majesty requested an audience with him and ordered him to follow now, which was a relief for the Duke because, in truth, he was worried about ending up being expelled, so he stood up with a nervous laugh. Gesturing for a knight to approach, he decided to continue with his mission, which was more important now. Showing a large number of gifts he brought for the visit, it was also a warning to take good care of An. If they tried to do anything against her, they certainly wouldn't stand idly by, and he himself wouldn't let anything happen to his wife. Meanwhile, the butler was explaining that the room on the other side belonged to the late Archduchess and was locked at the moment, and no one could enter or leave. Originally, their Majesties used the rune for generations, but after an incident, it was changed to the current one. Though in truth, none of that mattered, and An just wanted to escape from there. Finally, the butler finished the explanation and asked if she had any questions, to which the protagonist quickly said no. With that, he could assume she was familiar with the mansion's layout and asked her to rest a bit now. Finally, An managed to lie down for a moment and sighed in relief, though it still wasn't time to rest. When she got up, who appeared at the door was none other than Crave, smiling at her with that same innocent and happy look. And as he entered the room, she questioned why he was there, though it should have been obvious for the knight to always be by her side. An asked if he didn't disguise himself as a maid this time, which made him joke that she seemed sad that he wasn't a maid there by her side. Then he mentioned Cassian, wondering how someone as handsome and of good status as him married his leader, something the protagonist herself wanted to know. At the door, they heard knocks, and An asked who it was, to which the Archduke himself responded. This made An and Crave look at each other worriedly, while Cassian wanted to enter the room. The knight suggested the idea of hiding, but the protagonist refused because it could only cause an unnecessary misunderstanding. So, An simply told Cassian to come in, and he quickly noticed Crave's presence next to where his wife was sitting in the room, to which the protagonist said that he came to inform her that her uncle Sano also wanted to speak with her, drawing a less than happy smile from the Archduke. Finally, An asked what brought her husband there, while Crave averted his gaze, trembling because he was receiving that cold and frightening look again. The Archduke replied that he was there to inform her about the schedule for the next day, and also because he missed his wife. This left An speechless, not knowing how to respond, because things could escalate in a problematic way. At that moment, a maid approached to inform her that her bath was ready, but she was worried she might be interrupting something. An quickly denied that it was the case, actually feeling that it was the perfect moment for Eva to appear. She hurried past Cassian, saying she was going to wash up, and he smiled, telling her to go ahead, not seeming to have any problem with letting her leave the room. At the same time, Crave bowed, saying he would take his leave, but before he could pass by, the Archduke told him to wait. Closing the door, he asked if the knight could give him a moment, which worried Crave about his intentions, perhaps suspecting that his identity had been discovered. Laughing nervously, Crave hoped that smiling would make him seem more harmless, but it didn't seem to work on someone like Cassian. Finally, he nervously asked what Cassian wanted to talk about, because if he discovered who he really was, he would be in serious trouble. To his shock, the Archduke said he wanted to ask a few questions, one of which was to know Crave's true identity. It seemed it was too much to claim he had defeated those who attacked them earlier, but Cassian mentioned that he had a rough idea of who he was. There were two things he was curious about, his true identity and what his relationship with An was. Tensing up, the knight responded that it was a relationship too close to be explained in words. Crave didn't want to deceive him, but he apologized because he couldn't reveal everything in advance. He was worried and very anxious seeing how far An had come, so he followed her to ensure her safety above all else. After hearing all this in silence, the knight became concerned because it seemed like he had confessed everything, as if admitting to an affair. Stammering, he tried to explain things, but that was when Cassian asked if he was a sword master. The question left the knight completely surprised until he finally shouted, asking how he knew about that. He replied that there would only be one way to get rid of all the men who attacked the carriage, No matter how much he thought about it, Cassian deduced that only a sword master could do something like that. That's why he should have followed her from the beginning, because he was worried, yet he welcomed him to the Northern Empire as his uncle. This caught Crave even more off guard, because Cassian mistook him for Arn's uncle, but too nervous to correct the misunderstanding, they shook hands anyway. With that, Cassian smiled and said he could feel at ease because he was leaving now. Although Crave appreciated the misunderstanding, he wondered if it would really be okay for things to have unfolded this way. Later, he told the protagonist everything that had happened and that Crave had to pretend to be her uncle, which made her sigh because it was a golden opportunity, but she ordered him to leave, something the knight didn't want to do. However, Arn commented that he did resemble her uncle Gerhan a little, cheering him up when he asked in what way they were alike, and she skeptically responded that both were smiling idiots. But since that didn't seem like an insult to Crave, the protagonist sighed because she should try to do things correctly. Gerhan had a sword that was more famous than he was, the dragon-slaying sword Leviathan. There was only one sword that could replace it, and that was Evermore, the sword that Arn conjured with her powers. Upon seeing it, the knight was left speechless, impressed. Evermore was the opposite and the partner of Nevermore. It was born of light and guided lost souls from the battlefield to the Hall of Valor. It was the sacred sword. Crave felt that his leader was even cooler when she was holding a sword, until Evermore began to complain to Arn, but as it was only now being summoned, asking if by chance her wielder's love for her had diminished. This was because Arn had said before that she would save Evermore when she signed the contract. Ignoring this, the protagonist said she wanted to ask a favor of her that only she could do. This quickly excited the sword because it was being recognized and, of course, could carry out her grand and special mission. Then, Arn pointed to Crave, and Evermore finally noticed the knight beside her, hearing that she should be wielded by him for a while pretending to be Leviathan. The poor sword was incredulous at what she had just heard from her master. To ensure you don't miss the unfolding of this romance, give a gentle tap on the notification bell, and I see you on the next tale.